The graphical mode express setup is a little bit specific here because that's not something we have on the other platform. So the way it works is that if you have your switch or your 5760, so what I'll say here is valid for both platforms, connected, and then you have the power on, you can wait for the switch to come up. And then if you press the mode button for a few seconds, the lights above the mode button are going to turn green. Then you can connect your switch from any port in the front, of course, if it's a 3650 and 3850, and then that will give you the ability to get a web interface from where you can do this initial setup. The switch is going to behave like a DHCP server, and is going to wait for your connection at 10.0.0.1. So you don't need to configure an IP address on your laptop. It's going to be there automatically because you plug to the switch. This is how it looks like. I have one switch here. I press mode for 2 seconds, and when I do this, you see that suddenly the top bar becomes green. So that tells me that my switch, which is factory defaulted, is ready to get my connection. So I can plug to any of these ports, right? It doesn't matter. I plug this side here, plug the other side in my laptop, and I'm ready to go to get the initial setup done. On the other side, on my laptop side, I'm connected to that switch, and if you look at my configuration for my card, I didn't do anything. It's DHCP and I got an IP address in 10.0. something. It's a different subnet, but it doesn't matter because the only connection I have is the switch. So if I open a browser to 10.0.0.1, of course I get the self-signed certificate warning, which is normal, but if I continue, I'll get to this web interface where I can configure my switch. Credentials are, as usual, Cisco with a capital C, and depending on the browser, you may or you may not get that kind of warning. In most cases, you can ignore the warning, but it's better to use a browser that is supported. And then you get to that page, which is the Express setup, as they call it. I'm here on the 3850. And you see the setup is very basic, and it's not about wireless, right? It's about configuring some basic IP addressing so that I can telnet or HTTP to that box and configure it more deeply. So I need to set up an IP address, I need to set up a VLAN interface and a VLAN ID as well, a gateway, a switch password, netmask, a hostname, and of course, time. Time is very important. In advanced settings, I can also set some telnet or SSH access, and if I use Cisco Prime Infrastructure, I can also set some SNMP values. All right, submit. Then I have a warning saying that because the IP address is going to be changed, I may lose connectivity to my switch and I need maybe to reconfigure my laptop. Fine. And that's the setup. If you don't want to use that express setup of a web and you have a console connection to the switch, you can of course use the console connection to do the initial setup as well. When you boot the switch for the first time, you have this classical on iOS devices question, do you want to enter initial setup? And if you want to go to the configuration dialog, you can say yes, and here you can also provide some information to that switch about its basic connectivity information. Still, this is not wireless, right? We're just configuring the switch as a switch. It can be pretty extensive, so you can go through the basic setup, and that will save you some time about configuring each and every single interface. So I'm going to go to the basic setup and not the extensive setup. So that looks like the web interface in that you'll configure some items which are identical, like the name, password, secret password, right? Let me give you something super secret, Cisco, for example. And then if you want to use Telnet, what password you will use. So you see it's pretty similar. Here you can split into something which has some wireless impact because country code is going to be used primarily for wireless. So that's one difference with this web express setup we saw before. I'm going to set my country to the default, which is US. If you didn't configure the country, you would use US as a default anyway. So that's useful only if you want to change it. Then of course you can set up some HTTP access. This is not something you set with the Express setup on the website because they understand that if you set up web via web, then you want to use web. So that would be enabled by default. So here, if you were to choose not the basic but the extended setup, you would have to configure each of those interfaces. But here, because it's a basic setup, you can only configure the ones you need to configure. If you manage your switch using a VLAN, an SVI interface, then you have a problem because the SVIs are not created yet and VLANs are not created yet. This is where you would need the extended setup. This would be adapted if you want to configure that part, if you don't want to skip it, only if you use a routed interface to manage your switch, or use maybe the switch connection at the back, the gigabit interface 00, to manage your switch. That would be another possibility. So skip that part if you use an SVI, or set up a static interface, one that exists. And you see it's not auto-completing, so you need to be very clear on what you type in this initial setup phase. Then you would configure for this interface an IP address, mask, etc. as usual. All right, so that's the basic script, allowing you just to give this basic IP connectivity to the 36 or 3850. Then at the end, you can save that configuration or not. I'm not going to save it because I did the web interface before, so I would like to reuse it to access the switch and show you the graphical interface. Once your switch has an IP address, regardless on how you got it, through the CLI basic setup or through the web wizard setup, you can HTTP to that interface if you have connectivity to that switch, of course, and then you can go further into the interface to complete the configuration. Of course, you can also use the CLI, right? But I'm going to show you the simpler interface on the graphical interface. So whatever username and password you configure during the setup would be used here, otherwise defaults are, as usual, Cisco. And then you see you have these two branching interfaces at the bottom. One which is called the wired web GUI, and the other one which is called the wireless web GUI. We'll come back on those interfaces very soon. But for now, what you're trying to do is to do the setup, so you want to complete the configuration. And of course, our focus here is the wireless side of things, so let's go directly into the wireless web GUI. If you were to go to the wired interface, you would have a monitoring view of your switch as a switch. So again, you would maybe have to re-log in, and you would get this kind of view. You see, this is not where you will configure your switch as a switch. You would look at the configuration, and you may have some basic configuration item for the ports, but they are very limited. Most of what you will do would be on the CLI. This is, on the wired side, more of a monitoring interface for you to have a clear view of what's happening in your switch, which ports are on, which ports are off, etc. So we'll not spend any time on that wired side. So let's go back to the main interface and go straight to the wireless web interface. This is more elaborate, and this is where we'll spend most of our time. And as we are still in the initial setup, we go to Configuration, Wizard. And here there is another level of wizard which allows you to provide a more elaborate configuration to your switch, including some wireless items. So you may see some items that you also configured using one of the wizards we used before. And as a matter of fact, if you come here, you probably will have only gotten an IP address to your switch, and you would do everything from here. So you may see some repeats here between what we do here and what we did in the other wizards, but it's because, I'm just driving you through the different interfaces. In a real world, you would not do all the wizards you can have, right? You would do only one of them. So this one also allows you to set up some admin username, admin password, SNMP, connectivity, management ports, things you've seen in the other interfaces. But what is interesting is that there are some items like the wireless management and RF mobility and country code or mobility configuration that you haven't seen before. So this wizard is more like the ones we've seen in AirOS, where you will be providing information that not only allows connectivity to your system, in this case a switch, but also configure some basic items that will be useful to this machine as a wireless management engine. So let me give it an IP address. And we go back to this wireless management. And here you see you have the possibility to select a VLAN interface to manage my wireless access points. And the reason why it's interesting, it's because, as we'll see in a few minutes, the access points managed by this controller, the controller running on this switch, will have to be in the wireless management subnet. So you'll be able to not only define here what wireless management subnet you want to use, but also you can go down in the switch port configuration and make sure that the ports you want to have access points connected to are also selected to be in access ports in that VLAN. So that's a screen where you have more than one configuration that you can leverage to speed up your setup. Notice that the switch supports IPv6. We're not going to spend any time on IPv6 in this section either, but notice that IPv6 is present everywhere in all of the sections where you can configure IP addresses. So here let me put one port as a trunk, another one as an access port just to show you what happens, and then move on. Another new item, the RF group name. We didn't have that one in the previous wizard, at least not on this interface. So I can configure it here, also change the country code if I need to. And then in the mobility configuration page, same thing. I can define a role now. Is this box going to be a mobility agent or a mobility controller, which means that it would be both MC and MA. That is an option, of course, you have only on the switches, right? Because the 5760 would be an MC anyway, so that option would not be there because there is no choice to make. And if it's only a mobility agent, then you can point to the mobility controller, to the MC IP address, right from there. We'll come back on this configuration when we configure mobility in this architecture, but you see right here from the setup, you can get rid of all the configuration about MC to MA relationship. Just like on AirOS, you're supposed to have at least one SSID available, so you can configure it right here from the setup. Then those questions probably remind you of what we've done in the AirOS configuration, right? Where you configure also radius, and do you want to enable 802.11a and AC? Do you want to enable BGN? So those questions are similar on both platforms. Then last is the same as well, set time, and if you don't have any NTP, set time properly, because time is going to be important for authentication and many other things. Then save wizard is going to be applied to the switch, and now you have the basic setup on your switch, which allows you to manage access points and also manage access point SSIDs.